Hey guys, it's Matthew here once again with some more gameplay and endgame action of the Spectral Throw Deadeye dexterity stacking cold damage, well, Spectral Throw. Now, it did originally start as a pure dexterity stacking build, and it is still somewhat dexterity stacking, but it is a bit more of an afterthought at this point. So it's basically just the Deadeye Spectral Throw that is cold based, and it does use a dex stacking claw, but it really isn't super important in the build anymore. So the idea of the video is going to be to show you how fast the gameplay is, because the whirling blades and the spectral throw damage has just been super fast and super consistent throughout the mapping process, where it has been basically deathless throughout all of these maps, throughout all of the hardest shit I can do, and has been super fast with the whirling blade speed to the point where I kind of feel like I have two fast whirling blades thanks to the level of attack speed you can achieve through Tailwind and Frenzies and all the attack speed on the tree. And then on top of that, we do have some really solid damage coming out from Spectral Throw, and the single target actually quite surprises me for a Spectral Throw character at this point. You don't need any Molten Strike, you don't need any Blade Flurry, just Spectral Throw with slow projectiles ends up cleaning up the entire endgame content. Well, like a breeze, a dream. And then, of course, Uber Elder is a little bit tough, but that's because we're still not 100% cheesing with something like a Slayer, Ascendant, for example, or Combs Roots and all of that. But it is still, I think, with enough practice, pretty much deathless doable and a very consistent endgame farmer. So to begin with, I do want to show you some of the tier 16 Guardians, which get completely annihilated with, doesn't matter what map mods. This one has temp chains, for example. You will notice that I have temp chains on me most of the time, since the flask is not something I'm going to be using throughout just, ad phases and all that. And even with temp chains, you are insanely fast as a Deadeye, and you don't really notice the temp chains on your whirling blade speed, and the damage we're dealing is absurd, so that the spectral throws are just about one-shotting everything you throw at them. This is like an 8 mod corrupted map that I didn't even realize would have Chimera in it, because I thought I was doing my tier 16 Elder Guardians already. So it's something like perma temp chains, minus max, boss life, hexproof, bunch of random shit on it, and all of these Guardians, the tier 16s, the Elder Guardians, Shaper, Uber Itziri, I did manage to do purely deathless. I think the only actual deaths on this character were 2 random mistakes while I was, reading chat or whatnot, or actually just fucking around and also trying Uber Elder. So I did end up doing 3 Uber Elder runs, and managed to clear each one of them. The first one I had 3 deaths, the second was 2, the last one was 1 death. So it's very much capable of doing it deathlessly, I do believe, and I will show you the full 1 death run for your pleasure. For your viewing pleasure, rather, because it was pretty smooth and the damage is pretty absurd. And that is part of how you can take on Uber Elder, by having good enough damage to just get through the phases quickly, and thus not really get overwhelmed by too many of the mechanics. But basically, I do want to show you just how good the clear speed is, how comfortable it is with the cold damage, the Spectral Throw playstyle, paired with Deadeye that has a huge amount of reliable attack speed, a huge amount of accuracy, and a chunk of damage based off of all of the ascendancies that you get. And then we get back into some tier 16 Guardians and all that, and the Spectral Throw playstyle is just notoriously been one of my favorites. So it's always been one of my favorite skills and builds to play, and that's because it feels like you have so much control as to what your character does, how it avoids, how it goes in for the offense, especially paired with whirling blades. So all of that put together makes what I think one of the more complete playstyles in the game as a Spectral Throw just ranged character. Though once you slot in your slow approach for single target, you do become a bit more of a melee character. It really depends on how much projectile speed you get throughout the tree. And for Uber Elder and some of the Guardians, I did decide to get just a little bit of projectile speed so that I could stand at range whenever I felt like I really needed to. And for Uber Elder, that did seem to be more of a requirement. So we grabbed a bit of approach speed so we're not purely melee. And then I've also got an example of Uber Itziri here, where the damage was just completely stupid and absurd. And you can also see Aspect of the Spider doing some seriously good work on these boss fights. The biggest problem you will see right now is sometimes you whiff your spectral throws and you go So I got there and couldn't attack the dude, and he almost killed me through doing that, which was kind of my mistake. But then you got the freeze here. You can really see it comes into its own. You can perma freeze any one of those Atziri clones. So if you really want to play it safely, you can perma freeze the spear chucking ad and have really no damage coming back at you. Or you can perma freeze the ignite one, and then she'll never do a flame blast. So overall, the permafreeze ends up being a huge defensive boon of the character. And then we've got a Chiula example here, where just damage is pretty goddamn absurd. And then once again back into the Guardians and then Shaper. And then lastly, I will of course show you the Uber Elder fight after I go over the character for basically a little bit of a guide. And long story short, it's not really that much of a dex stacking anymore. I've got about 650 dex, so the weapon itself does add a good bit of damage, and it's probably the best thing I can do for elemental damage still, but a fizz to cold conversion might be better at this point. It is essentially just a cold stacking Deadeye Spectral Throw, and that should be doable at lower gear ends, and not too many heavy requirements of just pure dex stacking anymore. That was the experiment, just to see if we could get some dex stacking going and if it's worth it. Long story short, it is, but the gear requirement just is too steep in the end to get dexterity everywhere to make it truly worth it, so it ends up just being a Spectral Throw Deadeye. So to wrap up the character in full for you, it's going to be serving as a mini guide. It is a currently now level 92 Spectral Throw character as a Deadeye base. So Deadeye was somewhat of a surprise to me because I didn't really value just all of these little nodes together, but for Spectral Throw they actually worked really nicely. Now the main one being of course Tailwind, gives you a bunch of evasion and 20% faster everything, so attack speed, movement speed, all of that. Once you get the amount of stacks up going, and that should happen quite frequently when you actually attack bosses and play the game through mapping. You get quite a substantial amount of crit and crit multi, as well as life gain on hit, which is very nice for your defense through the rupture node here and the bleeding. And then of course we get plenty of damage and accuracy here, so we're capped on accuracy pretty comfortably through the little bit of dex stacking and this node here, and then of course something like 10 crit thanks to this node. So all in all, it ends up coming together as quite a lot of extra damage, and it's quite higher than our Raider and Pathfinder, though Pathfinder I think you will find will be just a bit more defensive in the flask uptime and survivability that it can offer. However, I think Deadeye is just a better Spectral Throw build at this point, and the passive tree is there for you to look at. The only really special thing is that we go purely cold. I did end up grabbing these nodes just for cold extra damage, a little bit of conversion from our fizz, and then these over here because I wanted the additional proj speed for something like an Uber Elder. And then also the other interesting thing is we use a cold steel to convert all of these nodes over here and here and here from physical to cold damage, so they become slightly more efficient for us to use. So in the end, we are still using this claw, which is 2 to 4 cold damage per 10 dexterity, a bit of attack speed, and then a crit roll. So it's a pretty basic claw, but it's about as good as you could realistically expect out of these things, because it takes about maybe 1 in 1,000 alterations to hit the cold dexterity mod. And currently I'm rolling with 660 dexterity, so it's nothing too huge, but it is still valued at probably almost close to the added cold damage support regardless. So it's basically a 7th link at this point for pure damage. So we're going all in on cold damage with just nothing but cold, a little bit of fizz. And you can see what the example of damage over here is. We're currently at 870,000 Spectral Throw, and that is with Frenzies up, which I keep up pretty consistently for everything. Full Tailwind, and of course we're bleeding, chilling, intimidating, thanks to the intimidation coming from the Tomb Fist gloves, and then of course we also have against Shaper and Guardians and all of that. So it's the best possible damage scenario we can envision, and it's with the claw. And for example, with our dexterity stacking, like I said, we get a decent amount of cold damage out of it. If you just use a basic claw with nothing but cold, attack speed, and crit, you do lose a good chunk of damage, about 100,000. If you use a decent 300 DPS claw with just physical damage, you lose a pretty decent chunk until you convert the rest. So you'd probably have to drop your Tomb Fist resist and run Crimnors, for example, and that's totally fine if you can't get the dexterity stacking mod early on, because that is going to be pretty hard to do. But I think the best version of the build on the easiest budget is probably just going to be something like a Cold Claw like this, or a Wasp Nest fully converting our damage, and then not at all focusing on dexterity throughout the build, because I haven't done too much dexterity focus, but I have done enough that it gets a little bit uncomfortable at times. So I'm trying to just build around this chest, for example. It's pretty similar to Belly of the Beast ultimately for life and defense, except it has the percent dexterity. So you're not really getting much out of that since it's not that worth it anyway. Star Conjure already has dexterity. A shield, the dexterity barely does anything there anyway, because it's only 40 and you can get some resist there instead. You can get some attack damage instead, or you can just run a Lycosidate altogether for more damage if you really want to. Then focusing on an amulet for dexterity is kind of awkward, so you can get flat cold instead, similar to this ring over here, just a bit of flat cold. And besides that, I really don't have much dexterity anywhere except for on the tree anymore anyway. So yeah, it's kind of a bit better than a pure Ellie claw, but ultimately a good Fizz one will probably get you further, and it's really just all about cold damage stacking anyway. So it's largely around the added cold gem, and then our Abyssal Jewels, which have some cold damage here, cold damage there, a little bit of cold damage there, and then the rest of our jewels just have a multi and projectile and all of that, because it's kind of hard to get the cold damage Abyssal Jewels, and you do need some multi somewhere, and largely the regular jewels is where you're going to get it. So as I'm mentioning, we have about 870,000 damage, and that's not factoring in point blank, because when you put point blank in the ideal circumstance, you get like 50% more damage. However, on the way back, it's going to give you less damage, so it shouldn't be anywhere near this level of damage, but it should be higher than 870,000 with point blank, and 870 only represents the single hit. So the first time you go in for the hit, that's one hit of 870,000 DPS. But typically a Spectral Throw, especially against a boss target, when you have the hit going at the very apex, especially with your Helm Enchant, the 30% reduced Spectral Throw deceleration, once you get at the absolute apex, for example, just sitting right there, it should hit multiple times, and thus this 870,000 DPS should be more like 3 million, I think, overall, with the point blank factored in and the Spectral Throw enchant and the absolute apex. That's why the boss damage in the video looks so goddamn impressive, because it's really a lot higher than this than POB will ever tell you or your tooltip will ever tell you. So for reference, I'm sitting at 76,000. Ultimately, it's more like 3 million at the absolute best case scenario. Now the rest of the gear, I haven't really changed since the last video, I don't think. I did go a Stygian belt instead of the Cyclopean coil, because I wasn't that into dex stacking anymore, and I really did want a bit of extra life and utility from an Abyssal Jewel, and I had to try and cap my resist as well as fit Aspect of the Spider in. So you got to get Aspect of the Spider as a suffix somewhere in your gear, because it's really quite worth it, 15% extra damage and all that slow. So in the end, we're then running Herald of Ice, Assassin's Mark, and Aspect of the Spider attached to a level 3 Enlighten. If you can't fit all of those in, I'd probably be dropping the Assassin's Mark myself personally, and then trying to get an Assassin's Mark on hit ring instead, just because it's fairly nice for the crit and the power charges for mapping. But these, I think, both Herald of Ice and Aspect of the Spider are the two things you should really be focusing on, and just stacking flat cold everywhere else you can. I don't think there's anything too much else to mention. I did grab a Fortify and a Frenzy attached to my single target there, just to beef up my Fortify and my Frenzy charges really quickly and easily, since I do have a lot of attack speed. But since the last video, I don't think there's too much else that I changed or need to mention. This is just a basic wrap up, and I will try and link my character's path of building in the video for this one. And you might be able to follow it with the right gear, with the right stacking. But I think at its base, we should probably just focus on pure cold stacking. Doesn't have to be a cold to dex claw. That's only if you can really get the gear available to you and start scaling quite a lot of decent gear. So I'll leave you guys with the end game Uber Elder kill, where I died one time. It's definitely doable without dying at all, as you can see the way I died in this run, but it is pretty tough to do, and it is certainly something that takes a good bit of practice. So I'll leave you with the run. Hope you enjoyed the character and the video. I love Spectral Throw. Hope you do too. And I will see you next time.
Putrefy, rot, spoil, and fester.
Exile, do something!
I'm not up to that just yet.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know how I'm going right now. The double tap was terrible. Oh, that was actually really good. We're very on point at the moment. Ah! After fighting Elder now, right? Run out of life flask. No, come on, man. Fuck! I zigged when I should have zagged. I needed to zag. But zig is life. That could have been the cleanest run anyone has ever seen. Hated when I should have French fried. Rookie mistake. Oh shit, he's slowing me right now. Deathless? Right? Right, guys? Deathless? Nobody saw that death. I get nothing all day, every day.